It was just another ordinary morning in Pine Hollow. The crisp autumn air slipped in through the open window as Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of cocoa. Her mother hummed softly while stirring oatmeal, and her father read the local paper in the corner. The sun was only beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the small cabin they called home. For Clara, it was a world of comfort and routine, just the way she liked it. Her dog, Scout, a shaggy, golden retriever, lay sprawled on the rug by the door, his tail occasionally thumping the floor as he dozed. But Clara noticed the stillness outside. The birds, usually chirping in the trees, were silent. Even the rustle of leaves seemed to have paused. Scout's ears perked up suddenly, and without warning, he jumped to his feet, letting out a loud bark that echoed through the house. Clara's mother, who had just set the oatmeal on the table, stopped mid-motion, her eyes widening. "What's got into him?" she muttered. Before anyone could react, the sound of Scout's frantic barking was followed by an unsettling silence. Clara's father, a man used to handling any situation, quickly stood up, placing the newspaper aside. His brow furrowed as he walked toward the door, scanning the yard. "What is it, Scout?" he called out, his voice tense. With a quick motion, he swung open the door and froze. A pack of wolves stood on the other side of the yard, no more than 20 feet away. Clara could see them clearly from where she sat, their sleek, gray fur blending with the shadows of the trees. Their eyes gleamed in the dim morning light, watching the house, unmoving. There were 7 of them in total, their sharp features framed by the surrounding forest. They seemed almost regal, with a calm, eerie presence that made Clara's heart skip a beat. Her father stepped back slowly, the door inching closed behind him. His face was pale, and he exchanged a glance with Clara's mother. "Stay inside," he instructed, his voice low. There was no fear in his tone, but Clara could tell he was unnerved. Clara, however, wasn't afraid. She felt a strange pull toward the wolves, an inexplicable sense that they weren't here to harm them. She could see the muscles in their bodies tense, their eyes darting back and forth, but they made no move to approach. They were waiting, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, this wasn't just any ordinary encounter. Outside, Scout stood frozen in place, his bark now just a soft whimper. Something was coming. But what and why? The moment Clara's father closed the door, the tension in the house was palpable. Clara's mother stood by the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the wolves, her hands trembling slightly. Clara, too, stood still, her gaze fixed on the creatures outside. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by Scout's soft whimpering from the other side of the door. "Why aren't they moving?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother shot her a glance, unsure of what to say. No one knew why the wolves had appeared or why they hadn't attacked. Their stillness was unsettling, as though they were waiting for something or someone. Clara's father, still pale, walked over to the phone, dialing the town's emergency number. "This isn't right," he muttered. The operator on the other end picked up quickly, sensing the urgency in his voice. "There's a pack of wolves outside our house. They're just standing there. We need someone to come out and help," he explained. The operator promised to send a ranger as soon as possible, but warned him that it would take at least an hour before anyone could arrive. As her father hung up the phone, Clara's mother rushed to the window again, her eyes scanning the yard. The wolves hadn't moved. They still stood in a loose semicircle, some with their heads raised, others with their eyes focused directly on the house. They weren't growling. They weren't showing any signs of aggression, but something about their presence felt like a challenge, like they were sizing of the house, almost as if they were trying to communicate. The sound of other vehicles soon filled the street. Within minutes, the neighbors began arriving in droves, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. Most of them kept their distance, standing in their front yards or peeking through windows, but no one dared to approach the house. Some whispered about the wolves, others speculated on what had brought them here. "This isn't normal," Mr. Thompson, the local shopkeeper, said as he arrived on foot, his eyes locked on the wolves. "Wolves don't come this close to town, not unless something's wrong in the forest." Clara's mother nodded, her thoughts clearly running in the same direction. Maybe they're hungry or lost. But Clara, still standing by the window, shook her head. She didn't think it was hunger that had brought the wolves here. There was something deeper, something the others couldn't see, a quiet connection that only she seemed to feel. For the next hour, the town waited. The wolves remained, their eyes never leaving the house. No one moved too close, and as the minutes ticked by, the anxiety among the townsfolk began to grow. They didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the start of something that would change Pine Hollow forever. As the townspeople stood in their yards, peering out through windows and whispering among themselves, Clara remained by the window, her eyes fixed on the wolves. To the adults, they seemed like a threat, a strange, silent force that had appeared out of nowhere. But to Clara, the wolves were something else entirely. She had always been drawn to nature, to the creatures that roamed the woods behind her home. She spent hours outside, collecting rocks and pine cones, pretending to be a forest ranger or simply watching the world around her. For weeks, she had been sketching wolves in her notebook, wolves that weren't vicious or wild, but calm and peaceful, as if they belonged with the humans who lived near the forest. Her mother had thought it was just a phase, but Clara had always felt there was something special about those animals, something she couldn't explain. Now, as she watched the wolves through the window, she felt a strange sense of understanding. They weren't here to hurt anyone. In fact, she almost felt that they had come for her, as if they were seeking something only she could provide. A feeling of calm washed over her, a deep certainty that everything would be okay. Her parents were still discussing what to do, their voices rising and falling in hushed tones. Her father paced the floor, his brow furrowed in frustration. What if they're rabid, or just desperate? He asked, glancing at Clara's mother. She shook her head, her voice tight with concern. We can't just go out there. They're wild animals. Clara's voice cut through the conversation. They're not dangerous. They're just watching. Her parents stopped and looked at her in surprise. Clara's mother, unsure, stepped closer to the window, her eyes searching the pack. The wolves had not moved, but Clara noticed the way they held their heads, alert but not aggressive. They're not hurting anyone, Clara added, her voice quiet but firm. I think they need us. Her father shook his head, as if trying to dismiss the thought. But Clara's calmness seemed to unsettle him. She was never this certain about anything. He could see something in her eyes, something that made him pause. For a moment, the fear in his chest seemed to ease, replaced by a growing sense of curiosity. Outside, the wolves remained perfectly still. It was as though they were waiting, patient and unwavering. Clara's words hung in the air, unsettling yet strangely reassuring. The question now was, why had they come? What did they want? And why did Clara seem to know more than anyone else? As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the house grew thicker. But Clara wasn't afraid. In fact, the more she watched the wolves, the more she believed that they were here for a reason. And she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all herself, forget it. The quiet tension in the house felt suffocating. The wolves, unmoving and watchful, had not shown any signs of aggression, but the people in town were growing restless. Clara stood at the window, still staring out, her young face calm, as if she understood the silent exchange happening between the wolves and the house. Her parents, on the other hand, were consumed with worry. Her father was on the phone again, speaking to a local ranger who had just arrived in town. I don't care how many wolves you've seen before, he said in a strained voice. There's something off about this. They're not leaving, and they're not acting like any wolves I've ever seen. Clara's mother, her arms crossed tightly, looked from her husband to Clara, and then to the pack of wolves. She wanted to trust Clara's calmness, but the situation felt too dangerous. Maybe we should go to the neighbor's house, she suggested, her voice tight. If we stay inside, they might leave. Clara shook her head, her eyes never leaving the creatures outside. They're not going anywhere. They don't want to hurt us, she said softly. Before anyone could respond, Scout, who had been unusually quiet since the wolves appeared, began to whine loudly. The sound startled everyone in the room, but it was Scout's next move that sent shockwaves through the house. Without any warning, the dog scrambled to his feet and darted toward the back door. He barked once, and before Clara or anyone else could stop him, the door flew open and Scout bolted outside. "No, Scout!" Clara's father shouted, but it was too late. The little dog raced toward the yard, his tail wagging with excitement. The wolves didn't flinch. Instead, they parted just enough to let Scout pass through their midst. Clara watched, her breath held tight in her chest. For a moment, it seemed as if the wolves would surround him, as if they would take him down without hesitation. But that didn't happen. Instead, Scout trotted right through the center of the pack, his ears perked and his movements carefree. The wolves didn't growl. They didn't lunge. They didn't attack. They simply stepped aside, forming an open path for the dog to walk through. Scout trotted to the other side, stopping to look back at the house before turning and running in the opposite direction toward the trees. Clara's parents were stunned. The crowd of onlookers in the distance gasped, their anxiety momentarily replaced by confusion. Clara's father stood frozen, his hand still gripping the door. "What in the world just happened?" he murmured, his eyes wide. Clara didn't answer. She already knew the answer. The wolves had let Scout pass, unharmed, unthreatened. They had shown no aggression, and in that moment, Clara understood. The wolves were not here to hurt them. They were here for something else, something far more significant than anyone had imagined. The air was thick with confusion as the townspeople watched Scout, unharmed and unbothered, disappear into the woods. The wolves remained in place, their eyes still fixed on the house, but the silence was now broken by murmurs and hushed voices. No one understood what had just happened. How could the wolves have allowed Scout to pass so calmly, without a single sign of aggression? It was as if they had known he wasn't a threat. Clara's father stood in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, his eyes scanning the yard. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Wolves don't act like that. Not unless they're desperate or starving." Clara's mother moved to join him, her face pale with worry. But they couldn't hurt him. They didn't even try to. Why would they just let him go like that? Clara, however, wasn't surprised. She stood by the window, watching the wolves with a calm certainty. She had known all along that the wolves weren't here to harm them. She could feel it in the air, a quiet understanding that ran deeper than anything her parents could comprehend. Minutes later, a group of wildlife experts and rangers arrived, their trucks kicking up dust as they pulled into the driveway. They were quick to assess the situation, but even they seemed bewildered by the behavior of the wolves. The pack remained where it was, their posture relaxed but watchful. No one dared to approach too closely, but the rangers took their time, inspecting the wolves from a distance. "We've never seen anything like this," said Ranger Daniels, a tall man with a stern face. "Wolves don't come this close to human settlements, and they certainly don't let pets pass without reacting. These animals are either lost or, well, something's wrong in the woods." Clara's father frowned. "What do you mean? What could be wrong in the woods?" Ranger Daniels hesitated before answering. "We've been getting reports of illegal traps set up deep in the forest. Poachers, probably. It's driving the wildlife further out of their natural habitats. We think these wolves might be seeking shelter or even food." Clara's mother shivered. The thought of poachers in the forest was unsettling enough, but the idea that these wolves had been pushed out of their territory by human greed made her heart ache. She turned to Clara, who was still staring at the wolves, her expression unreadable. Clara had known there was something more to this encounter, something beyond the wolves simply wanting food or shelter. She could feel the pain of the forest, the animals driven away from their homes. But there was more to the wolves' presence, something urgent, something only she seemed to understand. The rangers discussed the next steps, but as they talked, Clara's eyes shifted back to the pack. The wolves had not moved, but they weren't leaving. And somehow, she knew they wouldn't be gone until their message had been understood. As the rangers and wildlife experts continued their conversation, Clara stood apart from the crowd, her eyes locked on the wolves. They had not moved, but she could feel their presence like a silent force surrounding the house. The adults were caught up in their theories, their discussions about poachers and food shortages, but Clara knew there was something more. She could sense it deep inside her. The wolves hadn't come just for shelter or safety. They had come for something else, something only she could understand. Her parents were still talking to the rangers, their voices fading into the background. Clara's mother had been suggesting they evacuate for safety, but her father was insistent on staying. He couldn't bring himself to believe the wolves weren't a threat. They're wild animals, he argued. They could attack at any moment. Clara's mother nodded, her eyes scanning the pack nervously. But why haven't they attacked? Why did they let Scout pass through them without a single growl? Clara spoke up, her voice calm but certain. Because they're not here to hurt us, she said softly. The words felt right, even though no one else seemed to believe her. They just want us to understand. Her father turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. What are you talking about, Clara? He asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. You can't possibly know what they want. Clara didn't answer right away. She simply stood there, her small face pressed against the window. She felt it, an overwhelming certainty. The wolves weren't just lost. They weren't here by accident. They had come because they needed help. And somehow, Clara understood that they had chosen this house for a reason. Sometimes, Clara said, her voice steady, the forest speaks to us. It's like a message, but you have to listen closely. I've been listening for a long time. Her mother and father exchanged an uneasy glance. Clara had always been different, more in tune with nature than most kids her age. She had an affinity for the woods, for the animals that lived there. But now, her words seemed almost prophetic. The wolves weren't just here to escape danger. They were here to make a plea. And Clara was the only one who seemed to know it. She had drawn pictures of wolves before, images of them standing in front of a house, peaceful, not attacking. Now, Clara realized the truth. The wolves had come to her because they trusted her to understand what they needed. While the adults argued and speculated, Clara stood there, her gaze soft but determined. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. The wolves hadn't chosen the wrong person to trust, and somehow she was going to help them, if only the adults would listen. The next morning, the wolves were still there. The pack had not left the area around Clara's home. Despite the growing unease among the townspeople, there was something different in the air, an energy that seemed to pulse around the house. People had gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, their faces filled with uncertainty and concern. Clara's parents were no exception. They were still grappling with what had happened, but Clara seemed resolute, her gaze steady on the wolves who stood in a loose circle just beyond their yard. It was clear now that the wolves weren't going anywhere, and the town, fearful and confused, was being forced to confront a situation unlike any it had ever faced before. Everyone was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about wild animals roaming too close to town. This was something bigger. The local town meeting, which had been called to discuss the wolves, was packed. People filled the small community hall, their whispers and murmurs creating a low hum of anxious chatter. Clara sat with her parents in the back, unnoticed by most of the crowd, but watching intently as the meeting unfolded. Mayor Thompson, a man who had always prided himself on his calm and pragmatic leadership, stood at the front. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. We've been dealing with wildlife in the area for years, but this is something new, he said, addressing the group. We've called in experts, but the wolves' behavior is unlike anything we've ever seen. They're not acting like normal wolves. We don't know what they want, but it's clear they're not going to leave until we figure it out. Clara felt the weight of the room's gaze on her parents as they discussed possible plans, whether to drive the wolves away or to keep their distance. No one spoke directly to Clara, but she could feel the rising tension. The adults were stuck in their fear, unable to see what she saw. It was at that moment that Clara stood up. Her small voice cut through the room, quiet but filled with a wisdom that made everyone pause. They don't want us to drive them away. They're here because they need help. The room went silent. Clara's father glanced at her in surprise, while her mother looked at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. They're not here for food, Clara continued, her eyes locked on the mayor. They're here because something is wrong in the forest. They don't have anywhere else to go. They need us to protect the woods. The adults in the room exchanged uncertain looks, unsure of what to make of Clara's words. But Clara's certainty, her calm demeanor, started to shift something in the room. They had been debating the problem from a place of fear, but Clara was asking them to see it from a different perspective. For the first time, the townspeople listened. They began to understand. The wolves weren't just a threat. They were a sign. Something had gone wrong in the forest, and it was time for Pine Hollow to make a choice. Would they continue to turn a blind eye to the dangers threatening their natural world, or would they protect it? The meeting continued, but the conversation had changed. The town was starting to see the truth Clara had known all along. The wolves weren't a threat. They were a warning. The following days were filled with an urgency that had never before gripped the small town of Pine Hollow. The wolves remained, their presence no longer an ominous threat, but a symbol of something much larger, the delicate balance between the natural world and human progress. Clara's words had sparked something in the townspeople, and though not everyone fully understood, there was a growing sense of responsibility to act. Clara's parents, though still anxious, began to see things differently. They'd heard the rangers' reports about poachers in the area, and after Clara's insistence, they had agreed to join the others in investigating the forest. The town had organized a group of volunteers to search for signs of illegal traps or harm to the environment. The wolves, they now realized, weren't simply there to warn them. They were survivors, pushed to the edge by forces beyond their control. As Clara walked through the woods with her parents and the group of volunteers, the forest seemed quieter than usual. The rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds felt distant, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was on the outskirts of the woods that Clara felt a shift in the air, a familiar pull, like a whisper calling her deeper into the trees. She motioned to her parents, her hand outstretched. "This way," she said softly, her voice barely audible. They followed her, and after a short walk, they came upon a clearing that none of them had noticed before. It was here that Clara saw it, a massive tree, its bark marred by deep cuts, almost as if someone had been chopping away at it. She knelt down, her fingers grazing the rough surface, and she could feel it, the pulse of something dark, something unnatural. The ground around the tree was disturbed, and Clara's heart sank as she saw the signs of human activity. Traps had been set, carefully concealed beneath the underbrush. But there was something more. Scattered across the forest floor were remnants of animal fur, broken branches, and signs of struggle. The wolves hadn't just been pushed from their land. They had been hunted. Clara's parents exchanged grim looks as they surveyed the area. The evidence was clear. This wasn't just about the wolves. This was about the destruction of the forest itself, its delicate ecosystem threatened by human greed. The wolves had come to Clara because they knew she could help. She had always understood the forest, its creatures, its pulse. And now the town needed to act, not just for the wolves, but for the future of Pine Hollow and the wilderness that surrounded it. As Clara stood in the clearing, her heart heavy with the truth, she made a promise to herself. The wolves had been her teachers, showing her the power of connection, the importance of listening to the world around her. She would be their voice now, speaking for those who had no words. The fight for the forest had only just begun.